Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, let's dive right into this. Today, we're looking at the fascinating mechanics, the math, and the actual on-the-ground realities of India's highest constitutional offices. We hear about the president and vice president all the time in the news, right? But the actual constitutional machinery running behind the scenes, it's incredibly nuanced, totally fascinating, and honestly, often misunderstood. So let's unpack exactly how this all works. Here's our roadmap for today. We're covering the highest office, a unique election math, the presidential toolkit, the whole rubber stamp or real power debate, the impeachment process, and finally, the vice president contingency.
Section 1, the highest office. So, to really understand the presidency, we've got to start with Articles 52 and 53. These firmly establish the president as the executive head of the Union, but to even step foot into this role, a candidate has to meet 4 very strict criteria. They've got to be an Indian citizen, naturally, and at least 35 years old. But here's where it gets interesting. They also must be eligible for election to the Lok Sabha, the lower house of parliament. And crucially, they absolutely cannot hold any office of profit under the government. Why? Well, it ensures the president doesn't have any conflicting financial or professional interests tied up with the very same government they're supposed to oversee. Makes perfect sense, right? And because of these specific qualifications, we've seen some incredibly diverse paths to the presidency. It's a really rich tapestry. Take Dr. Rajendra Prasad, India's very first president. He emerged directly from the Constituent Assembly. But then look at Dr. K.R. Narayanan. He brought an entirely different skill set to the table as a former ambassador and a university vice-chancellor. The Constitution intentionally leaves room for diplomats, scholars, and politicians alike to ascend to this top spot.
Section 2, a unique election math. Now, getting the job is where things get really unique. The president isn't directly elected by citizens like you and me. Instead, they secure the job through a highly specific electoral college. Let's demystify this math, because honestly, the design is brilliant. This electoral college consists exclusively of elected MPs and MLAs. Nominated members? Totally left out. And to make sure we have proportional representation, the value of an MLA's vote isn't just one. It actually varies based on their state's population. You take the state's total population, divided by the number of elected MLAs, and multiply that by 1/1000th. Meanwhile, all MPs have the exact same vote value, calculated by taking that massive total pool of MLA votes across the whole country and dividing it by the total number of elected MPs. It's this delicate, massive balancing act between the states and the center. But here is the real kicker. This incredibly complex electoral math, it's actually frozen in time. The state populations used for these formulas are not based on the latest data. Nope, they're strictly based on the 1971 census. And there's a good reason for this. It was done to ensure that states which successfully implemented family planning and population control weren't suddenly penalized by losing voting power in presidential elections. Pretty clever. Now, while the whole thing relies on a system of proportional representation with a single transferable vote, history did give us one wild anomaly. Usually a clear winner emerges right in the first round of counting. But V.V. Giri, who was a noted trade unionist, was the only president in history who had to be elected in the second round of counting. It's a super rare moment of nail-biting suspense in what is otherwise a highly predictable, mathematically tight process. Section 3, the presidential toolkits. Okay, so they've won the election, they've been sworn in by the Chief Justice. Now what? Well, the president commands a massive toolkit, and these powers are vast. They're broken down into 5 distinct constitutional areas: executive and administrative, legislative, judicial, military, and diplomatic. We're talking everything from acting as the supreme commander of the armed forces, meaning they are the sole authority who can declare war and peace, to appointing top Indian diplomats abroad. But for our explainer today, we really need to look closer at their legislative and judicial authorities, because those are incredibly potent. Check this out. Article 72 grants the president extensive judicial powers when it comes to clemency. And it's not just a simple yes or no on a pardon. They actually have 5 distinct ways to show mercy. They can offer a full pardon, completely absolving the offender. They can issue a reprieve to temporarily pause a sentence. They can grant a respite for special circumstances like a physical disability. They can give a remission to reduce the sentence period or commute a sentence to a lighter form entirely. And uniquely, the president is the only one who has the authority to pardon death sentences and court-martials. State governors absolutely cannot do that. Legislatively, the president's toolkit is just as impressive. Under Article 123, if Parliament is in recess, the president can just bypass them entirely to issue temporary laws called ordinances. And these aren't just suggestions, they have the exact same force and effect as a standard act of Parliament. But of course, there's a built-in check. These ordinances must be approved and ratified by Parliament within 6 weeks once it finally reassembles, or else they just expire.
Section 4. Rubber stamp or real power.
And this brings us to a debate constitutional scholars absolutely love to argue over. Is the president just a nominal figurehead, or do they wield actual, independent power? The debate usually kicks off right here, with Article 74(1). Originally, the Constitution just said the Council of Ministers would aid and advise the president. Simple enough. But then, the 42nd Amendment in 1976 totally changed the game. It made the advice of the Prime Minister's Council of Ministers strictly binding. The text now explicitly says the president shall act in accordance with such advice. On paper, this heavily implies the president is merely a nominal head, which is where that famous critique of the president being just a rubber stamp comes from. However, and this is a big however, while they generally have to follow that advice, there are highly specific circumstances where the president exercises pure, unchecked discretionary power. The absolute biggest one, appointing the prime minister. Think about it. In an era of coalition politics, if no party gets a clear majority in the Lok Sabha, or heaven forbid a sitting prime minister dies suddenly in office, the president doesn't have a council of ministers to advise them anymore. In that moment, they have to use their own discretion to invite a leader they genuinely believe can form a stable government. That's a huge deal. And history proves they definitely aren't just passive actors in the legislative process either. Presidents have tools like the suspensive veto and the pocket veto. For instance, Dr. Rajendra Prasad used his veto power on the PEPSU bill. Jani Zail Singh famously used the pocket veto, which is basically just ignoring a bill indefinitely, to halt the highly controversial Postal Amendment Bill. And Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam actually sent an electoral reform ordinance straight back to the cabinet for reconsideration. These actions prove the office isn't just a stamp. The president can act as a crucial friend, philosopher, and guide to the government. It really largely depends on the personality of whoever holds the office. Section 5. The impeachment process. So, what happens if a president goes too far and actually violates the Constitution? Interestingly, the Constitution itself leaves that term deliberately undefined, but Article 61 does lay out a strict quasi-judicial procedure for removal. It's not easy, and it certainly can't be done on a whim. A resolution can be introduced in either House of Parliament, but first, you have to give the president a 14-day notice, and a full 1/4 of the members of that initiating House have to sign it just to get the ball rolling. Then it has to be passed by a massive 2/3 supermajority of the total membership of that House. Once passed, it moves to the second House, which then takes on a completely different role. It essentially transforms into an investigating body. If that second House also passes it by a 2/3 majority after the investigation, the president is impeached. It's super important to note just how seriously that investigating phase is taken. When the second House investigates the charges, which is often done through a specially formed committee, the president isn't just sidelined. They have the explicit constitutional right to appear in person and to be represented by an advocate of their choice to defend themselves against the charges. It's a full-on legal defense.
Section 6. The Vice President Contingency.
If a president is successfully impeached, or if they resign or pass away, the Constitution does provide an immediate safety net, the vice president. But before we look at what they do, it's worth noting how the vice president even gets there, because their election is notably different from the president's. Their electoral college includes all MPs, so that's both elected and nominated, but it entirely excludes state MLAs. Plus, while a presidential candidate has to be eligible for the Lok Sabha, a vice presidential candidate must be eligible for the Rajya Sabha, the upper house. And that eligibility requirement makes total sense when you look at their actual day job. Under normal circumstances, the vice president's primary, day-to-day role is acting as the ex officio chairman of the Rajya Sabha. It's a lot like the speaker in the Lok Sabha. They preside over the sittings, maintain order, and guide the legislative business of the upper house. But let's be real, their true constitutional purpose is to be the ultimate contingency plan. If a vacancy pops up in the presidency due to death, resignation, or impeachment, or even just a temporary illness or absence, the vice president instantly steps up to discharge those functions. And while they're acting as president, they enjoy all the privileges and immunities of the highest office. Notably, to keep a strict separation of duties, they immediately hit pause on their duties as the chairman of the Rajya Sabha. They basically hold down the fort until a new president can be officially elected. Understanding all this machinery, from the incredibly complex election math to the binding of vice ministers to those rare but super powerful vetoes, it leaves us with a really compelling question. It's the final provocative thought I want to leave you with for our explainer today. When a true political crisis hits, when governments fall and parliaments are completely deadlocked, is this supposed rubber stamp office actually the ultimate, heavily armed safeguard of the Republic? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the Constitution. And as always, keep questioning the mechanics of power.